For 3 decades, I lived believing I was adopted. My parents called me the family maid while treating their biological children like royalty, until at my grandfather's funeral, a strange woman whispered, "You were not adopted, you were kidnapped. Your real parents never stopped searching for you." She handed me old newspaper clippings and said, "The reward now tops $91 million. My name's Aaron Bennett, I'm 34 years old, and I was standing at the back of my grandfather's funeral, feeling like a ghost. The air in the chapel was thick with the scent of lilies, a cloying sweetness that felt like a beautiful lie trying to cover up something rotten deep in the soil. It was the perfect scent for a Bolton family gathering. My grandfather, Arthur Bolton, was the only person in that family who ever really saw me, and now he was gone. He was a quiet island of kindness in an ocean of cold indifference. Up at the front near the polished casket stood the rest of them, Howard and Denise Bolton, the people I was taught to call Mom and Dad, and their sons, Adam and Kyle Bolton. They were performing their grief for the audience, their faces arranged in masks of sorrow that didn't quite reach their eyes. I wasn't family, not really. I was an obligation they'd fulfilled, a charity case they never let me forget. I could feel their cold shoulders from across the room, a familiar chill I'd felt my whole life, a constant reminder that I didn't belong. I wasn't one of them. My dress was a simple black one I'd bought myself, unlike the expensive, tailored morning clothes they wore. I was an afterthought, just as I'd always been. To avoid looking at them, I focused on a memory of Arthur, his gentle, wrinkled hands moving a chess piece across the board in his dusty study. He was teaching me the game, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Always think 3 moves ahead, Aaron," he'd said, tapping the head of the queen. "Anticipate, see what's coming." I hadn't known it then, but he was teaching me more than just a game. As the organist began a somber hymn, a faint, phantom scent of cinnamon cookies flickered at the edge of my mind. It was a memory with no source, a warm, comforting smell that had haunted me for years, always feeling like a question I couldn't quite form, let alone answer. After the service, as people milled around the chapel offering hollow condolences, a woman with nervous, bird-like eyes approached me. She was older, maybe in her late 60s, and her hands trembled as she clutched a worn, manila envelope. Her name was Lydia Porter, a name that meant nothing to me then but would soon mean everything. "You're Aaron, right, Arthur's granddaughter?" she asked, the hesitation in her voice hanging in the air between us. It was a hesitation that told me she knew, somehow, that the word was a lie. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward my parents, her fear so strong I could practically feel it radiating off her. They were holding court near the entrance, accepting sympathy like it was their due. "Arthur wanted you to have this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me to wait until he was gone. He said you'd know what to do." She pressed the envelope into my hand. It was thick and strangely heavy, as if weighted down with secrets. Her skin was cool and papery against mine. I looked from her terrified face to the plain brown paper in my hand. "What is this?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarse. She leaned in closer, her whisper urgent and sharp. "You weren't adopted," she said, and the words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. "You were taken. They paid me to forge the papers. I worked at the agency." "I'm so sorry." Before I could process the monstrous weight of what she'd said, before I could ask a single question, she was gone. She scurried away, melting back into the crowd of dark suits and black dresses, leaving me standing alone with the weight of the envelope in my hand. It felt heavier than a tombstone. I stood there, frozen, the sounds of the funeral reception fading into a dull roar in my ears. "Taken," the word echoed in the sudden, vast emptiness inside me. I didn't go to the wake. I couldn't have faced them, couldn't have endured the fake sympathies and the cold stares. I walked out of the chapel in a daze and drove straight back to my small apartment, my sanctuary located above my bakery. The envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, a silent, ticking bomb. The city of Portland passed by my window in a blur of gray buildings and rainy streets. I didn't see any of it. My world had shrunk to the space inside my car, to the horrifying words of a stranger. Inside my apartment, the familiar scent of yeast and sugar from the bakery below did nothing to comfort me. I dropped my keys on the counter and sank to the floor, my back against the kitchen cabinets. For a long moment I just stared at the envelope. My hands shook as I finally tore it open. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, brittle with age. The first headline screamed up at me: 4-year-old Natalie Bennett vanishes from Seattle backyard. The date was April 1994. Underneath the headline was a photo of a little girl with a gap-toothed smile and big, solemn eyes. My eyes. I traced the shape of her face with my fingertip, a face I knew from my own mirror, just younger, softer, unburdened. The article described a sunny afternoon, a swing set, an unlocked gate. It quoted her heartbroken parents. And then I saw it, a line near the bottom of the column. The little girl's favorite snack, according to her mother, was homemade cinnamon cookies. The phantom scent I'd been chasing my whole life suddenly had a source. It was a ghost from a life I never knew I'd had. The article mentioned her parents by name, Thomas and Grace Bennett. It also mentioned a reward, a small fortune they'd offered for her safe return. A more recent clipping, an anniversary piece from just a few years ago, showed that the reward had grown over the decades. It was now a staggering $91 million. The final clipping was a small, recent one showing a simple website address, bennettfamilysearch.com. It wasn't just shock I was feeling. It was a horrifying, clarifying click, as 30 years of feeling like a misplaced puzzle piece of never quite fitting in suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. My entire life, my name, my very identity was a lie. And the people who stole me, the people who raised me as their unpaid servant, were the ones I was supposed to call Mom and Dad. I must have sat on my floor for hours, the clippings spread around me like evidence at a crime scene. My crime scene, the life of Aaron Bolton, was the lie, and the ghost of Natalie Bennett was the truth. Outside my window, the city lights of Portland began to glow as evening set in. I could hear the faint hum of the cooling racks from my bakery downstairs, the rolling pin. I had built it from nothing, scraping together every penny I earned cleaning hotel rooms to get through community college, then working double shifts to save for my first commercial oven. The bakery, the weight of the dough in my hands, the satisfaction of a perfect loaf, it felt like the only real thing in my life. And now, even that felt precarious, like it was built on a foundation of lies I never knew existed. The website address on the last clipping seemed to burn on the paper, bennettfamilysearch.com. It was still active. A digital monument to 30 years of hope, a hope I never knew was being held for me. My thumb hovered over the search bar on my phone. Typing in that address, making that call, would be the final, irreversible step. It would mean the life I knew, the identity I had, was truly over. There was no going back to being Aaron Bolton, the grateful adoptee who never caused any trouble. That person never really existed anyway. She was a fiction they created to make their crime easier to live with. I thought of Arthur, of his quiet kindness and the sad, knowing look he sometimes had in his eyes when he looked at me. He wouldn't have wanted me to live this lie. He had sent Lydia Porter to me. This was his final move, the one he'd been planning for years. I owed it to him and to the little girl in the picture to see it through. Before I could lose my nerve, I typed in the address and the site loaded. At the top of the page was a phone number right under the words, "Have you seen Natalie?" My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hand was steady as I dialed. A man with a calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Bennett Family Search, this is Marcus." I took a deep, shuddering breath. "My name is Aaron," I said, my own name feeling foreign on my tongue. "I'm in Portland, Oregon. And I think I might be Natalie Bennett." The man's name was Marcus Reed, a private investigator. He told me he'd been working for the Bennett family for the last 15 years, long after the official police investigation had gone cold. He didn't sound shocked or overly excited by my call. He sounded cautious, his voice layered with the weariness of someone who had followed 30 years of false leads and crushed hopes. It was a tone that strangely made me trust him more. He asked me a few simple questions first, my age, my date of birth, where I grew up. When I told him I was 34, there was a brief pause on his end. I was the right age, then he asked for the names of my adoptive parents. Howard and Denise Bolton, I said, the names feeling like ash in my mouth. This time there was a sharp intake of breath. The Boltons, he repeated, his voice suddenly losing its detached calm. We looked into them years ago. Your grandfather Arthur contacted us anonymously. He said we should look at his son, but there was no evidence. Howard had an alibi for the day you were taken. We couldn't make it stick. My blood ran cold. Arthur had tried. He had tried to get help. Marcus seemed to sense my shock and quickly regained his professional tone. He told me he would drive down from Seattle to Portland first thing in the morning. He was emphatic about discretion. No sirens, no media, no police yet, just him. Tell no one, he warned, his voice low and serious. Especially not the Boltons. If this is real, Aaron, if you are who you think you are, then these people are dangerous. They have everything to lose. I hung up the phone, a profound sense of dread and determination warring inside me. I was alone, but I knew I couldn't stay that way. I scrolled through my contacts and pressed the button for Jade Monroe, my best friend. I didn't tell her everything on the phone, just that something terrible had happened and I needed her. I couldn't form the words to explain it all yet. My voice was trembling too much. Just come, I whispered into the phone. She was at my door in 20 minutes, her keys still in her hand. She took one look at my face, at the newspaper clippings spread all over my living room floor, and her expression shifted from concern to a fierce, protective anger. She didn't ask any questions. She just walked in, wrapped me in a hug, and then went to the kitchen to make coffee. That was Jade. She knew when to talk and when to just be there. And right then, her quiet, solid presence was the only thing holding me together. Jade stayed with me that night. We didn't talk much. She just sat on the couch, a silent guardian, while I stared at the clippings, my past rearranging itself into a dark, twisted mosaic. Every memory of my childhood was now tainted, recast in a sinister light. I saw it all with horrifying new clarity. The hand-me-down clothes, always a little too worn, a little too faded, while Adam and Kyle got new sneakers and brand-name jackets for every birthday and Christmas. The endless chores, scrubbing the kitchen floor on my hands and knees, weeding the massive garden until my fingers were raw, cleaning the bathrooms while the boys played video games in the living room. It wasn't discipline, it was unpaid labor. I was their live-in maid. I remembered my mom, Denise, her voice thin and sharp, telling me I should be grateful for a roof over my head whenever I dared to complain or ask for something. Grateful. As if they were saints for giving me the bare minimum required to keep a child alive. I remembered my dad, Howard, his face a mask of annoyed dismissal when I asked questions about my birth parents, which I only did once or twice as a little girl. The past doesn't matter, Aaron, he'd said curtly. We are your family now, that's all you need to know. He wasn't protecting me from a painful past, he was protecting himself from a criminal one. The only warmth in that bleak landscape of memory came from Arthur. He was the one who snuck me books from the library when Mom said I should be focused on my chores instead of filling my head with nonsense. He was the one who quietly slipped me $5 for the school book fair when I knew asking my parents was pointless. For my 16th birthday, when my parents gave me a set of new cleaning supplies as a joke, Arthur gave me a small, carved wooden music box. It played a simple, haunting lullaby. It was the only beautiful thing I owned. I spent that long, sleepless night grieving a life that was never mine and fearing the one that was waiting for me just hours away. Marcus Reed arrived at my apartment door at 9 o'clock the next morning, exactly when he said he would. He was a big man built like a retired linebacker, but his handshake was gentle and his eyes were kind. He took in my small apartment, the flower that seemed to perpetually dust the air from the bakery below, the stacks of books in every corner, and he nodded slowly as if he was seeing me, not just the case. He didn't treat me like a curiosity or a winning lottery ticket. He treated me like a person whose world had just exploded. "This must be a lot to take in," he said, his voice a calm rumble. I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The DNA test was a simple cheek swab. He opened a sterile kit on my small kitchen table and explained the process clearly. I held still as he gently scraped the inside of my cheek with a long cotton swab. He sealed the sample in a vial, labeled it with a code, and placed it carefully into a padded case. He told me he'd drive it directly to a private lab in Seattle that worked with him on sensitive cases. He promised he'd have the results by the next morning. The speed of it was both a relief and a terror. I showed him the manila envelope Lydia Porter had given me. He handled the old clippings with care, taking high-resolution photos of each one with his phone. His expression was grim, his jaw tight. He asked me about Arthur. I told him about the chess games, the books, and the music box. A flicker of interest crossed his face when I mentioned the box. "Sometimes small kindnesses are the key to everything," he said, more to himself than to me. "A person trapped in an impossible situation finds ways to leave a trail." After he left, the silence in the apartment was deafening. My entire future, my past, my very name, hinged on a tiny sample of my own cells sealed in that vial. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I tried to bake, but my hands trembled too much to properly knead the dough. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. Jade stayed, a quiet, reassuring presence, making sure I ate something. His phone call came at 7 a.m. the next day. I snatched the phone off the counter before the second ring. "Aaron," Marcus said, his voice different. The professional caution was gone, replaced with a deep, solemn warmth. "It's a 99.9% match. It's you or Natalie." He paused for a moment. "Welcome home." My real parents, Thomas and Grace Bennett, wanted to see me immediately. Marcus told me they wept when he gave them the news. After 30 years of waiting, they didn't want to wait another minute, but they were considerate. They didn't demand I come to them, to their world in Seattle. They didn't want a media circus or a sterile meeting in a lawyer's office. They wanted to meet me here in my home, on my turf. They wanted to meet me at my bakery. I spent the morning baking with trembling hands, the familiar motions of measuring flour and cracking eggs the only thing keeping me grounded. I baked a batch of cinnamon cookies, the recipe one I'd perfected over the years, never knowing why it felt so important to me. By the time they were due to arrive, the bakery was filled with the warm, spicy scent of my stolen childhood. When they walked through the door, the little bell above it chiming softly, it was like looking at a distorted reflection of myself. Grace Bennett had my curly hair, though hers was streaked with silver now, and she had the same slight tilt to her head when she was listening. Thomas Bennett had the same gray-blue eyes I saw in the mirror every single day, his face etched with lines of grief that I was only just beginning to understand. Grace's hand flew to her mouth and a sob, 30 years in the making, escaped her lips. Thomas just stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and a pain so profound it was hard to look at. I felt my own composure crumble. I did the only thing I could think to do. Would you like some coffee?" I asked, the ridiculously normal gesture hanging in a moment that was anything but. Grace laughed through her tears and nodded. As I turned to the coffee machine, she reached out and gently touched my face, her fingers tracing my cheekbone as if she were trying to memorize every line. "Natalie," she whispered, and the name, my real name, felt both strange and utterly right. Thomas finally moved, stepping forward and wrapping his arms around both Grace and me in a careful, trembling hug. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. Pressed between them, smelling the faint scent of my mother's perfume and feeling my father's heart beat against my back, it was the first time in my life I felt like I had truly come home. It was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere. We sat for hours in the small seating area of my closed bakery, the smell of coffee and cinnamon filling the air. We tried to fill the 30-year gap in our lives with hesitant questions and tearful answers. They told me about the day I was taken. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon. I was playing on the swing set in our backyard in Seattle. My dad had left the side gate unlocked for just a minute while he carried in groceries. When he came back out, I was gone, just like that. They never gave up hope. When the police leads went cold after a few years, they poured their own money into the search, hiring private investigators like Marcus, setting up the website, and keeping my story alive in the media any way they could. The $91 million reward wasn't some casual number. Thomas, an architect who had designed half the skyline of Seattle, explained that it was nearly everything they had. It was a symbol of their desperation, a fortune they would have gladly given away for just one more day with me. I told them about my life with the Boltons, but I glossed over the worst of it. How could I tell these two people, their faces already so full of pain, that their daughter had been treated as a servant, that she'd been emotionally neglected and raised to feel worthless? It felt too cruel. I told them I had a good education, that I'd started my own business. I focused on the positives, on my survival. Grace cried quietly when I told her about my faint, lifelong memory of cinnamon cookies. She used to bake them for me every week, she said. It was our special treat. Thomas's grief was quieter, but it was there in the hard set of his jaw, the way he clenched his fists in his lap whenever I mentioned Howard Bolton's name. A deep, cold anger radiated from him. By the time they left, promising to come back the next day with lawyers and plans, the news was already starting to leak. Marcus had warned us it was inevitable. A lab technician, a reporter's cousin, it didn't take much. The first tremor of the earthquake that was about to shatter my life had begun. That night, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I knew by heart but hadn't dialed in over a decade. It was the Boltons' landline. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my hand slick with sweat. It was my mom, Denise Bolton. Her voice was just as I remembered it. Sharp, brittle, and laced with a cold fury that always made me feel small. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, skipping any pretense of a greeting. "You're making a fool of yourself and embarrassing this family with these lies." She didn't ask if it was true. She didn't express a single moment of confusion or concern. She went straight to accusations, her words like tiny, sharp icicles. I was being selfish. I was chasing money. I was ungrateful for the life they had given me. It was the same script she'd used my entire childhood, anytime I'd wanted more than the scraps they offered. Then I heard a rustling on the line and my dad took the phone. Howard's voice was different. It wasn't loud or shrill like Denise's. It was low and menacing, a gravelly threat meant to intimidate. "You have no proof, Aaron," he said, his voice a low growl. "Nothing but the words of some crazy old woman. It's your word against ours. You'd better think long and hard before you try to ruin our lives. You have no idea what you're getting into." They weren't worried about me. They weren't remotely remorseful for what they had done. They were angry. They were furious that they'd been caught. The call was like a splash of icy water to the face. Any lingering, confused feelings I had about them, the complicated residue of a lifetime of conditioning, vanished. In their place grew a cold, hard resolve. They didn't just steal a child 30 years ago. They stole my name, my family, my entire life, and they felt entitled to it. I didn't say a word back to them. I just listened to their threats and then I quietly ended the call. They had just declared war, and for the first time in my life I was ready to fight back. That phone call was the first hard piece of evidence I had that wasn't from the past. It wasn't about a kidnapping 30 years ago, it was about their character right now. Their immediate response wasn't confusion or denial or even a feigned concern for my well-being. It was a threat. It was a command to be silent and grateful, just like always. I realized, sitting there in the quiet of my apartment, that they had been counting on my silence my entire life. They had raised me to be the quiet, grateful girl who never made waves, who never asked for too much, who never questioned their authority. That girl was their shield, but that girl was gone. They had killed her with their own words, with that single, furious phone call. I grabbed a notepad and a pen from my kitchen counter and wrote down every detail of the conversation I could remember, the exact phrasing of Howard's threat. The sharp, accusatory tone in Denise's voice, the time they called, the number they called from, it was my first piece of evidence against them collected by me for me. Their panic told me everything I needed to know. They knew what they did, and they were terrified that the little girl they'd raised to be invisible was finally about to be seen. This wasn't just about reclaiming my past anymore. It was about making them accountable for it. The media storm was starting to brew. I could see the first local news van parked down the street from my bakery, a dark shape in the pre-dawn light. This was getting bigger than I could handle alone. I called Jade, and this time I told her everything. From Arthur's funeral and Lydia Porter's envelope to the DNA match and the reunion with my parents, and finally to the threatening phone call from the Boltons. She listened without a single interruption, the silence on her end of the line humming with a gathering storm. When I finally finished, my voice raw and exhausted, her first words were, "Okay, what's the plan? And who do we need to destroy?" Her unwavering belief in me, her immediate jump to my defense, was an anchor in the swirling chaos. She didn't question my story for a second. She just accepted it, and her righteous anger on my behalf was a strange and powerful comfort. She immediately went into practical mode. She took my phone from my hand. "You focus on what you need to do with your family and the investigator," she said, already scrolling through the flood of incoming messages from unknown numbers. "I'll handle the vultures." She brought over bags of groceries and a couple of changes of clean clothes from her place, turning my small apartment into a command center and refuge. She reminded me in her blunt and loving way that I wasn't the broken, lost girl the Boltons had raised me to be. I was a business owner. I was a friend. I was a survivor who had built a life for herself from scratch. Her presence was a physical shield, allowing me the space to breathe, to think, and to move past the raw shock and start planning my next move. My next move was to call Marcus Reed. I told him about the Boltons' call, repeating Howard's threat word for word. He wasn't surprised. "Bullies and cowards always resort to threats when their control slips," he said, his voice grim. "This is good, Aaron, they're making mistakes. Keep a record of everything." He advised me to get a lawyer immediately, someone who specialized in high-profile cases. My parents, he said, were already on it. They had contacted one of the best firms in Seattle. But I knew a lawyer and a DNA test weren't enough. The Boltons had said it themselves. "It's your word against ours." They would do everything in their power to discredit me. They would paint me as a liar, an opportunist, an unstable woman chasing a massive reward. I needed more. I needed irrefutable proof of their intent, something that would tear down the facade of the loving, adoptive family they would surely try to construct. My mind kept going back to Arthur. He had been so deliberate, so patient. He knew something. He had left a trail for me to follow. The music box he gave me for my 16th birthday sat on my dresser. I picked it up, its dark wood smooth under my fingers. I wound the small key on the bottom. The familiar, simple lullaby began to play, the same tune that had haunted the edges of my memory for years, a melody without a source. I suddenly remembered something Arthur had said when he gave it to me. He'd looked at me with those sad, kind eyes and said, "Some things are kept safe for the right time, Aaron. This key is more important than you know." It hadn't made any sense to me then, but now the key wasn't just for the music. It was for something else. The key was tiny, made of aged brass, and it slid out easily from the winding mechanism of the music box. I held it in the palm of my hand, studying its simple, old-fashioned cut. It wasn't a standard key for a door. It looked like a key for a diary or a jewelry box or a safe deposit box. The memory hit me with sudden clarity. Arthur had taken me to the bank with him once when I was about 15. I'd waited in the lobby while he went into the vault area alone. He had a safe deposit box. It felt like a long shot, a desperate guess, but it was the only lead I had, the only move Arthur could have left for me on the board. I called Marcus and told him my theory. He was quiet for a moment, and then I heard him let out a low whistle. "The old man was playing the long game," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. He was intrigued. With the full weight of my birth parents and their new high-powered lawyer, we were able to get a court order to access Arthur's box. It was a legal maneuver, citing my status as a missing person and the ongoing criminal investigation. Walking into that downtown Portland bank felt surreal. The Boltons thought they had all the power, that they had silenced everyone and controlled the narrative for 30 years. But Arthur, quiet, gentle Arthur, had been playing a longer game right under their noses. The bank manager, a stern-faced woman who looked at us with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, led us into the chilly, silent vault. She used her master key on box number 412, and then she stepped back, gesturing for me to use mine. My hand trembled as I inserted the small brass key from the music box. It slid in perfectly. The lock turned with a satisfying, solid click, and the heavy metal door swung open. My heart was pounding against my ribs. This was it, Arthur's final move in a chess game that had lasted my entire life. The metal box wasn't full, but every single item inside was a bombshell. The first thing I saw was a small, leather-bound ledger, the kind used for bookkeeping. I lifted it out and opened it. Inside, in Arthur's neat, careful script, was a detailed record of cash withdrawals from his personal accounts, all from the spring and summer of 1994. The total came to $45,000. Next to each entry, he had made a simple note: for H. Ray Brightway. H was for Howard, and Brightway Adoption Services was the name of the now-defunct agency Lydia Porter had mentioned. This was the money they used to pay her to buy the forged papers to buy me. Beneath the ledger was a single Polaroid photograph. It was me, age 4, standing in the Boltons' overgrown backyard. I was wearing a little yellow dress I didn't recognize, holding a worn-looking doll and crying, my face streaked with dirt and tears. On the back, in the same neat script, Arthur had written the date. It was April 24, 1994, the day after I was reported missing. It was proof I was there, in their possession, before any legal adoption could have possibly taken place. There was also a small stack of letters, drafts written on Arthur's personal stationery. They were letters he'd written to Howard and Denise, begging them to come clean, pleading with them to return me to my parents. They had clearly ignored him. He hadn't just been kind, he had been my secret guardian, my silent witness, collecting evidence piece by piece. He had been trapped, I realized, terrified that if he went to the police, his son would run and I would disappear forever. So he waited, he gathered proof, and he waited for me to be old enough and strong enough to use it. This wasn't just evidence. This was Arthur's apology and his weapon, passed on to me. At the very bottom of the box, nestled in the corner, was a single cassette tape in a clear plastic case. The label, written in Arthur's familiar hand, was simple: H&A, May 1994, Howard and Arthur. A month after I was taken, Marcus had a portable cassette player in his car for surveillance work. We didn't even speak. We just packed up the contents of the box and walked quickly back to his car, the gravity of the moment settling on us like a heavy shroud. We sat in the bank's parking lot, the midday traffic rushing past us unnoticed. Marcus slid the tape into the player and hit the play button. The audio was scratchy with age, but the voices were clear and they were filled with a desperate, ugly energy. It was Arthur and Howard locked in a furious argument. The ransom note was a bust. Howard's voice was agitated, almost hysterical. They never responded. We don't know what to do. We have to get rid of the kid. Get rid of the kid. The words made my stomach clench. Then Arthur's voice boomed through the small speakers, firm and horrified. She is not a piece of evidence, Howard. She is a child. We are not getting rid of her. You made this mess. You will raise her. You will do this right, or I swear to God, I will burn you to the ground myself. It all crashed down on me in a wave of nausea and chilling comprehension. I wasn't an adopted child. I wasn't even a replacement for a child they had lost. I was the living, breathing evidence of a failed ransom plot. My entire childhood, every chore, every cold word, every moment of neglect wasn't just poor parenting. It was a 30-year cover-up. They kept me not because they wanted me, but because they were too cowardly to get rid of me. I made the choice right there, sitting in that car, the tinny sound of my past echoing around me. I would use it all, the ledger, the photo, the horrifying tape. I would not be quiet, I would not protect them. For Arthur and for the little girl in the yellow dress, I would burn them to the ground. With Arthur's evidence, everything changed. We moved from a strange and tragic family matter to a major criminal case. The police were officially involved now, and the district attorney's office was building its case. My real parents and I, along with our new lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Vance, decided we had to get ahead of the story. We held a press conference. Standing at that podium with a wall of cameras flashing like strobe lights and dozens of reporters shouting questions was the most terrifying thing I'd ever done. My hands were trembling so badly I had to grip the sides of the lectern to keep them steady. My father, Thomas, stood just behind me, his hand a warm, steadying presence on my back. My mother, Grace, stood on my other side, her fingers intertwined with mine, squeezing gently. They were my anchors. Eleanor Vance spoke first, laying out the basic, verifiable facts. The DNA proof that I was Natalie Bennett, the evidence of a fraudulent adoption facilitated by a corrupt agency, and the existence of an ongoing criminal investigation into Howard and Denise Bolton. She was calm, professional, and gave away nothing more than she had to. Then it was my turn. I spoke for less than a minute, my voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. I looked out over the sea of cameras and microphones. My name is Natalie Bennett, I said, using it in public for the first time. For 30 years I lived under another name. Now I have been found. I told them I was asking for privacy as my family, and I navigated the unimaginable legal and emotional process ahead of us. I didn't mention the ransom plot, I didn't mention the tape. Eleanor had insisted we hold that back. It was our trump card, the knockout punch we would save for the courtroom. The story exploded. It went from a local human interest piece to a national headline overnight. I was no longer Aaron the baker. I was the stolen Bennett heir. Adam and Kyle were the kind of brothers who'd learned early how to use a camera to bend the truth. They didn't come at me with facts. They came with a story that smelled like privilege and training wheels. The tabloid sent a shiny camera crew to their cul-de-sac, and they stood beneath a maple tree with practiced expressions, sharing an exclusive that felt rehearsed down to the pauses. Adam, the older one who always knew how to smile for a crowd, sounded worried in the way that people who mean to manipulate do. Aaron's always been unstable, he told the reporter like he was sharing some private diagnosis. He used my adoptive name, Aaron, like a label someone peels off a file. He quoted anecdotes about meltdowns and attention-seeking behavior, the kind of small, cruel details families recycle to make a liar seem believable. Kyle, who'd always been quiet and resentful, went darker. He threw out the same line my dad used at home, "She should be grateful." He added the new twist the reporters loved, money. He suggested that my Bennetts were trying to buy their way into a happy ending. "A $91 million reward," he said on camera, eyes narrowed. Who wouldn't be tempted? The clip cut to a close-up of him nodding solemnly, then to a slow pan over our old house as if the camera could make guilt visible. They were experts at the old family defense. Frame the victim as unstable, frame the true parents as opportunists, and never, ever talk about the uncomfortable parts of the story. They spoke in a soft, rehearsed way about giving me a home and showing me love, while a caption under the video read, "Aaron's return sparks messy family feud." Their interviews ran on loop across morning shows and social feeds. I watched them on my laptop as my stomach twisted into hard, strange knots. For a dizzy second, I felt that old rush of doubt. What if I was chasing money? What if I really had misremembered things? Then I thought of Arthur and the music box, of the ledger and the Polaroid, and the sound of Howard's voice on the tape. The doubt evaporated. They weren't trying to make sense of a complicated family story. They were trying to drown the truth in noise. Their sons were not defending a family, they were protecting an empire of lies. Watching Adam and Kyle perform for the cameras felt like a second kidnapping. This time, my story was being taken from me and reshaped to fit their version of comfort. The worst of it was how quickly the narrative spread. People believed what was loud and easy, the internet filled with hot takes and cruel one-liners. Some viewers were compassionate, but too many took the polished interviews at face value. For a day it felt like the world was listening to them instead of me. But what they didn't have was the evidence: Arthur's careful notes, Lydia's confession, Marcus' lab results. They had optics and a camera and an angry willingness to smear. I had truth. It was messy, human, and heavy, and that would have to be enough. My bakery turned into a front row seat to everything ugly about publicity. Reporters parked their vans so close they blocked my delivery truck. Their microphones, with logos I'd seen a dozen times on the evening news, were pointed like weapons through the bakery window. People I'd made cinnamon cookies for over the years came in with hugs and tears, while others shoved their phones at me, snapping photos I didn't ask for. I learned what it felt like to be contained by a glass box, visible, analyzed, boxed up for other people's consumption. The first morning there was a line of people wrapped around the block before we even unlocked the door. Some held signs that said "Welcome home," others held placards that read "Con Artist." Someone left a bouquet of wildflowers on the stoop. Someone else hurled an empty beer can into the gutter. A man in a jacket shoved a camera at one of my bakers and demanded answers about whether we were serving the real Natalie. A woman in a Prius took pictures through the window and posted them with a caption questioning whether I'd ever actually been mistreated. One person shouted at me through a megaphone, "Money-hungry liar," and another left a child-sized apron in the doorway with a scribbled note. "We forgive you." It was a kaleidoscope of mean and kind, and it turned a simple morning shift into a survival exercise. I had to close the bakery for a week. The noise made it impossible to work. How do you frost a cake when a drone hovers outside? My staff, who'd been with me since the beginning, were resilient and scared for me. Jade became my buffer, fielding calls and emails, setting up a new schedule so they could work odd hours and avoid the worst of the crowds. She organized a private line of communication for regular customers who wanted to order in and not wade through the media circus. My employees wore Bennett and daughter masks before the shop even existed, laughing through exhaustion and grief, trying to keep the place intact for when we could reopen. Someone once called me a gold-digging liar in person, outside the bakery right after the news vans left. She stood in the rain and shouted it until a security guard from a neighboring store stepped in. I felt the warmth of flour on my hands and the sting of someone's words like splashed vinegar. My safe space had been infiltrated. The counter where I'd once handed over warm biscotti to a regular, the table where I'd scribbled recipe notes and sticky reminders, felt violated. They'd taken my privacy the way they'd stolen my childhood, without asking and without remorse. Being under siege sharpened everything. I learned to keep my phone on silent, to drink tea that had gone cold, to answer polite friends' concern with a short message so I could save my voice for the court. My apartment upstairs became a place to sleep 5 hours here and there between meetings. I started sleeping with the music box on my nightstand again, its tiny melody grounding me when the world's noise wanted to drown me out. I missed the ordinary afternoons of kneading dough until my shoulders ached and humming to myself while the oven warmed. Those small, ordinary comforts felt like contraband now, treasures I was hoarding until the day this storm passed. With the trial inching closer, Alina wanted everything in the cleanest possible form. The cassette tape had to be restored and made admissible. We couldn't just play a scratchy relic in front of a jury and hope it landed the way we needed it to. Alina hired a small team that specialized in audio work and forensics. They took the tape apart, cleaned the reels, digitized the sound, and cranked up the clarity without altering the content. Watching them work felt like watching someone unroll an old map to find a hidden road. The tape was fragile, but what it held was a path straight to the truth. We all sat in Alina's office on the day they handed me the digital file. Marcus, my parents, Alina, and me. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and stale coffee. The sound engineer fed the files through a speaker system positioned to give the best fidelity without sounding dramatic. For a moment before the first word played, the air felt thick with waiting. I pressed my hands into my knees until my nails went white, feeling that old chess lesson in the bones: think 3 moves ahead, anticipate what's coming. When the tape started, the voices were clearer than they had been in the car. They weren't just snippets. It was a conversation, the kind of ordinary, human, terrifying exchange that made the whole thing feel less like a sensational headline and more like a steady, cold crime. Howard's voice was the first, jittery and angry, unraveling as the men's plan collapsed around them. "It was your idea," he spat, blaming someone else for the mess he'd made. It was a small thing, but his tone, blame without shame, cut across the room like a shard. Arthur's reply was slower, full of the kind of outrage that comes from someone who's realized they were betrayed by the person they'd trusted most. He said he had talked about asking for help not taking a child, and the way his voice broke made everyone in the room draw breath. It wasn't just that he'd argued with Howard, it was the clarity of what he called it: a plan, an idea turned into a crime, step by cowardly step. And then Denise's voice came in. It was whiny and scared, not the stern matron most people expected, but small and selfish. "If we let her go, she'll identify us," she said. "We have to keep her." It hit like a punch. There was no pretense of affection, just a terrified equation: keep the child, keep ourselves free. That line wiped out any illusion that this had been some messy, emotional decision made out of love. It was not protection. It was protection of their own skin. Hearing them argue hour after hour changed the way the room looked. My mother put her face in her hands. My father's knuckles whitened on his knee. Marcus sat very still, his jaw tight, old anger crawling up his neck like heat. Eleanor, who'd seen 1,000 messy cases, simply sat straighter and, for the first time the way I could tell, allowed herself to look almost excited. Not for the crime, obviously. For the moment when the jury would hear what we were sitting through now, plain as spoken word, uneditable, a record of their motive laid bare. What the tape revealed wasn't just panic. It spelled out the whole terrible logic. Howard had been failing financially and in pride, and he'd seen an opening. He'd watched a small child playing in a yard one day and decided to step in first on impulse, then in calculated steps. He wrote letters that he couldn't send, or maybe never meant to send. He left a note as insurance, not as the start of a ransom. When the plan didn't go the way he wanted, the fear was what sealed the worst of it. He suggested keeping the child because it was easier than facing the consequences of having tried something criminal. The tape made the whole thing ugly in ways nothing else could. It showed that it wasn't a single moment of moral failing. It was a chain of selfish choices: see money, think quick fix, panic when it doesn't work, cover it up. Arthur had been the one who tried to make it stop. He'd seen the stakes and done what he thought was least harmful at the time: hide the truth so the kid would be safe. That made his notes and his ledger an act of contrition, and it painted the others in stark, hard lines. When it ended, no one spoke for a long time. We all sat with the echo of their words in the room. The tape had done what we'd hoped. It took motive out of rumor and put it in black and white, no, in worn magnetic tape where the jury would have to grapple with it. I felt a cold clarity settle under my ribs. This was right. This was ugly and true, and that truth would be the blade we used in the courtroom. When the last words on the tape faded, the room felt colder, like someone had opened a window and let all the heat out. Listening to it again, in a quiet office with good speakers and people who understood the stakes, made the conversation less like a distant memory and more like a live crime scene. My mother, Grace, was silent, her shoulders shaking as if she couldn't hold herself upright. My father, Thomas, sat with his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. Marcus sat very straight, jaw tight, watching me like he'd watched dozens of cases, but this one hit him differently. Eleanor, who usually kept her face an unreadable mask, looked at the others and said simply, "This is it. This is the whole case." Hearing them talk wasn't enough. Hearing them plot made all the gray areas clear. Howard's voice blaming Arthur, Arthur answering with that mixture of fury and regret, Denise whispering that we had to keep me because they would be identified. Those words removed the last fog. It wasn't an argument that could be filed under family drama. It was proof of motive and plan, step by selfish step. The tape showed Howard had thought he could turn a desperate idea into a quick fix, and when it failed, he chose cowardice over right. Denise's suggestion to keep me wasn't protection, it was survival instinct for their own skins. When Alina put the player on pause, she didn't have to say much. The sound had done the work people couldn't argue with. It placed the crime where it belonged, on them. There was no longer any room to hope this was a misunderstanding born of fear or poor judgment. The tape made it ugly and deliberate. For me, a strange calm settled in my chest. It was the kind of calm that follows a decision when you know you've chosen the right thing to do, even if the road ahead is brutal. We had the evidence that would press on the jury's sense of right and wrong. We had motive. We had confession in ink and in voice. The plan was set. I would tell my story in court, and then we would play the tape for everyone to hear. After that meeting, there wasn't any turning back. The sequence of our moves felt like a chess game finally beginning to play out on the board Arthur had set up for me. I thought about his last warning, always think 3 moves ahead, and felt, for the first time in my life, like I wasn't the pawn anymore. I was making moves and I could see the path forward. The week before the trial hit like a physical thing, heavy and constant. Depositions and strategy meetings filled my days until I felt like I lived in a conference room. Alina and her team were steady and focused, but the other side was loud and ruthless. Their lawyers filed motions trying to keep Arthur's tape out of court, to limit what I could say, to make the whole thing about procedure instead of truth. They subpoenaed my bakery's records, my bank statements, even my old school papers, anything they could use to make me look like I was after money or unstable or unreliable. Every new paper felt like a punch. My phone buzzed with questions from reporters, strangers, and people who thought they had a right to my time. Night after night, I'd lie awake and watch the ceiling and feel the weight of the whole world pressing down on my chest. I started to dream the same dream, a dark basement and small hands reaching through a crack in the floor. I woke up sweating, my throat raw from a scream I hadn't made. The cameras outside weren't the worst of it. It was the sense that my private pain had been turned into public spectacle. My life, the thing I'd built with flour and stubbornness and late nights, was under a microscope. People debated me on TV like a character in a show. Columnists wrote about motives and incentives. Strangers sent me messages ranging from sympathy to pure hate. Even with Thomas and Grace and Jade rallying around me, I felt isolated in a way that made my bones ache. I could see Alina quietly preparing questions and answers. She knew the landscape better than anyone, but there were nights when I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about stepping away. Not because I wanted to forget, but because the cost, emotional, practical, and the danger to others felt suddenly enormous. I'd always believed telling the truth mattered above all. But now I could see how many people would get hurt in the process, how many fragile lives might be pulled into the crossfire. Then came the call that felt like a sledgehammer. Lydia Porter, the woman who'd given me the envelope, called Alina in a near panic. She was shaking, telling Alina she'd received a letter, an ugly, anonymous thing that said she should keep her mouth shut and stay out of this. She cried into the phone about being scared, about living on a fixed income and not wanting trouble. For a moment, everyone in the room felt the air go thin. Without Lydia, our paper trail looked much thinner. She was the only one who could corroborate the forged documents, the Brightway connection, the way the papers had been made to fit. For a few hours, my confidence wavered in a way I hadn't expected. I sat in my dark kitchen and felt the old, familiar chip start to deepen in my chest, the part of me that always believed I was a burden. If I pushed this fight, I might be sending Lydia into danger. I might be making my parents fight in public again. I might be dragging Jade and Marcus and others into a mess. Maybe the quiet life I'd made, the bakery, the small circle of people who loved me was worth protecting, even if it meant letting the Boltons keep their secret. The thought that maybe I should just walk away, change my name, close shop, hide, hovered like a siren. It was the kind of small, traitorous thought that feels like relief at first but is actually surrender. I sat there and imagined the front window of the rolling pin dark, the registered name of Bennett erased, a soft life without subpoenas or cameras. For a terrifying second, I almost wanted it. But then I thought of Arthur, of the ledger, of the Polaroid of a crying little girl in a yellow dress. I thought of the baking of cinnamon cookies that had always been more than a smell. It was a thread that connected me to a family who had kept my picture on their wall for 30 years. And more than anything, I thought of Lydia, trembling and brave enough to hand me that envelope at a funeral. My dad found me that night, sitting on the floor with my head in my hands. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat beside me, closing the space between us with a soft, sure presence. I felt his hand rest on my shoulder, a simple, solid touch that seemed to say, "You are not alone." Then he looked at me, his voice low and steady, and told me something I needed to hear in the worst way. "This is not your fault," he said. "None of it. You are not a burden. You are our daughter, and we are proud of you for doing this." He told me that he and Mom had spoken to Lydia directly. They had offered her money, yes, but also something more immediate, protection and support. They'd paid for a security consultant, helped arrange a temporary place for Lydia to stay, and had convinced her that she wouldn't face this alone. Lydia, he said, had been scared but moved by the idea that I had the courage to confront the truth. She told them she wanted to help finish what Arthur had started. Those words felt like a rope thrown down into a dark chasm. My dad's voice didn't try to erase the danger Lydia faced. He acknowledged it and then refused to let fear be the final answer. "She's going to testify," he said, and in that sentence there was both relief and resolve. He promised us both that he and Mom would be there every step of the way. They would sit through the court days, they would watch the tape with a steady face, and they would make sure Lydia was safe. Hearing that settled something inside me. The music box on my nightstand seemed to hum a little louder, as if it agreed. Arthur had been careful and patient and had left his evidence in a way only an older man could, slow, sure, and meant for a future he might not see. Now that future was here, and it wasn't just mine to bear. My family had stepped forward to protect others, to shield the tiny, brave woman who'd given me my first clue back at a funeral. The doubt that had crept in, the thought that I was a burden, that I was asking too much of people I loved, dissolved under the light of their action. I sat up straight then, the decision solidifying like something set in concrete. I wound the music box and let its lullaby play once more. It was a small, steady thing in a world that was wildly unsteady. I felt the truth of Arthur's lesson in my bones. There would be hard days ahead. There would be nights I would want to run, but I was no longer the quiet girl who accepted the scraps. I was Natalie Bennett, and I was going to finish what Arthur started. I would stand in that courtroom, tell the truth about my life, and let the tape do the rest. The courtroom smelled like old wood and paper and a kind of clean that felt designed to hide things. It was full, every bench taken, the gallery a sea of faces I didn't know and a few I did. There were reporters in the back with notepads and wary faces and a bank of camera lights near the entrance. My birth mom and my birth dad sat in the front row, hands clasped together so tight their knuckles were white. Marcus was there, stoic as ever. Jade had managed to get a seat, and Alina sat at the table with a stack of papers and a look that said she was ready for whatever came next. When my name was called, my legs felt heavy. I walked up the aisle past rows of people whispering like leaves. I climbed the steps and swore I wouldn't look at them. I didn't want to give them anything, no comfort, no tears to twist, no reaction to use. I climbed into the witness box and sat. The bench felt too hard, like it belonged to a world that didn't understand softness. Alina started with simple questions, the sort that let me tell the story without the needle of cross-talk. She asked my name, where I grew up, what my life had been like with the Boltons. I talked about the chores, about the way my hands always smelled of bleach and dish soap because of how often I was told to scrub. I said how Adam and Kyle got new things while I patched old clothes. I described being taught to say thank you for things that weren't kindness. I told them about Arthur and the chess games, about the music box he gave me and how he taught me to think a few moves ahead. When a leaner asked me about Lydia Porter and the envelope, I told the jury exactly how it had happened, standing at Arthur's funeral, a woman's hands trembling as she pressed the manila envelope into mine and whispered words that rearranged my life. I told them the clippings, the photo, the tiny detail, cinnamon cookies that had fit like a missing piece. I spoke slow and steady. I wanted the facts to sit in their minds like stones, not shards. I wasn't asking for pity. I was putting a long, ugly truth on the table and asking them to listen. The defense lawyer came at me with a kind of practiced politeness that had teeth. He circled questions like a hawk. "Isn't it true, Miss Bennett," he said, "that you stand to benefit financially from this being true? A $91 million reward is a lot of money. Isn't that a strong reason to say what people want to hear?" I held my breath for a second and then let it out. I looked straight at the jurors, not at him. "The only thing I want is the truth acknowledged," I said. "It doesn't erase 30 years. Money doesn't change the fact that a little girl was taken from her family." My voice didn't shake. I let the words land. He tried to make my memories look convenient. "You mentioned cinnamon cookies. That's a common childhood memory. How can you be sure it links you to the Bennetts?" "It's proof to me," I said. "It's the smell that woke something in me. It's the thing that united the clippings with my life. Memory isn't always neat, but when it lines up with evidence, Polaroids, ledgers, a tape, then it's part of a bigger picture." I said Arthur's name like a benediction. Arthur was the only one in that house who treated me like a human. He left me answers. He asked about my work history, my bakery, my bank accounts. He wanted to paint a picture of motive, of someone who could be bought. When he suggested that my grandfather might have been confused in his old age, that he could have misunderstood what happened, I felt something cold and furious rise up. Arthur wrote the ledger with dates and amounts. He kept a Polaroid of me at 4 years old in their yard. He recorded Howard and himself arguing about what to do. That isn't confusion, that's a record. He did what he could to protect me and to make sure the truth could be found. I kept my tone steady. I wasn't the girl who shrank. I was the one who had the evidence. He tried to rattle me with small cruelties, old rumors, a few mean neighbors' quotes, questions about my age and whether memories could be trusted. I answered each one plainly. I told them about nights on the floor scrubbing, about being called ungrateful when I asked why my name was different. Every time he reached for a wedge, I answered with something solid. The ledger's handwriting, Lydia's confession, Marcus test results. He wanted me to look like someone selling a story. I wanted the jury to see a woman who'd finally been given back her name and was trying to fit the pieces into a life that had been stolen. When a leaner stood up and said we would play a piece of evidence, the air in the room shifted. The speaker setup looked small and almost harmless on the evidence table, but we all knew what it carried. I watched the defense counsel tighten at his seat. I watched my adoptive mom and adoptive dad, Howard and Denise, sitting there with a calm that had always been performative. Their faces were masks that had been practiced in front of mirrors. But as the first scratchy words came through the speakers, something in both of them changed. The tape started with Howard's frantic voice. The ransom note was a bust. They never responded. "We have to get rid of the kid." Hearing that in a courtroom in front of strangers whose job was to weigh truth and lies felt like watching a house of cards fall. You could hear a breath leave the room. Then Arthur's voice, steady and furious, answered back, "She is not a piece of evidence, Howard. She is a child. We are not getting rid of her." Hearing him say my name in that old argument was strange and terrible and beautiful all at once. It was like a ghost finally speaking for the living. Denise's voice came in, small and urgent. "If we let her go, she'll identify us. We have to keep her." That line landed in the room and did what we'd hoped the tape would do. It took motive from whispers and put it plain and ugly into everyone's ears. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was a human voice admitting the calculus they'd made. When the recording ended, the silence felt heavy and then electric, like the whole courtroom had been turned on and was seeing something for the first time. I watched Howard go colorless. Denise stared at the table, her fingers trembling. The jury looked stunned, hands fisted in laps, eyes moving between the speakers and the defendants. The defense counsel tried to hide his surprise behind a cough and a flurry of papers, but whatever he'd been preparing for wasn't this. Later, after a string of negotiations and the weight of that tape, the Boltons took a plea. There was no dramatic, primetime verdict. It was a quieter end than a public trial might have been, but it was final. They admitted guilt and accepted a sentence, 25 years behind bars with at least 15 years before any chance at release. I didn't go to the courthouse that day. I didn't need to see them in orange or watch them led away. Watching them shrink into the legal system on television felt like watching a chapter close in a book I didn't want to reread. Their sons disappeared from the media almost immediately, their carefully framed interviews and practiced sorrow evaporating now that the truth had voice. Lydia sent me a small card a few weeks after the plea deal, a thin piece of paper with shaky handwriting that said simply, "I'm sorry." I did what I could. I wrote back, keeping my handwriting tight and calm. I enclosed a check small against the scale of what she'd helped undo, but big enough to help her live without fear. I also wrote an invitation. Come to the bakery opening. She'd earned a cinnamon cookie. The cameras moved on. The noise that had felt endless started to thin. There were still people who whispered in the grocery store line or who typed angry comments online, people who never cared about truth unless it fit their feed. But the constant, cloying presence of vans, microphones, and bright lights faded like a weather front moving on. I started to get my life back in small pieces. Short days in the bakery, a phone call from my birth mom about the new curtains for the shop, a joke from my birth dad about the way he couldn't measure flour to save his life. The sentence didn't make the missing years less painful. There are nights when the quiet slices through me and I wonder what it would have been like to have those years with a family that loved me openly, to have a childhood without chores as punishment, to have a teenage life that wasn't built on fear. But the sentence closed a loop. It made the Boltons answer for what they'd done in a way that mattered. It meant they couldn't continue to hide behind polite smiles and storybook versions of their care. I kept the music box on my nightstand. Sometimes I wind it and let the tiny melody play until it loops and the room is tiny and safe for a moment. I think of Arthur a lot, of his slow, stubborn bravery in keeping that ledger and that tape. I think of Lydia's trembling hands at the funeral. I think of Marcus, who drove across the state and never treated me like a prize. I think of Jade, who stood guard and made sure my flour never stopped dusting the air. And most of all, I think about the small, steady life I'm rebuilding, one cinnamon cookie at a time. We used a portion of the reward to make good on Dad's sketches. He'd drawn the place on napkins and the back of envelopes for months, imagining a bakery that felt like home instead of like something I had to hide in. We found a spot in Fremont with big windows and a crooked brick wall that gave it character. We called it Bennett and Daughter because it felt honest and simple, my name and the woman I became. We split the rest of the money in ways that would let me breathe without losing what mattered. A quarter we tucked away for safety, the kind of cushion I'd never had when I was scraping by. The biggest share, nearly half, went to the Natalie Bennett Foundation. Mom and Dad insisted. They wanted to do something that mattered beyond us to help other families who were still waiting. The foundation funded search efforts, supported therapy for kids who'd been lost and found, and helped families who couldn't afford private investigators. It felt right to turn what had been taken from me into something that might prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. Building the bakery was messy and loud and full of love. Dad tried to help in the kitchen and made a glorious mess with flour and measuring cups. He could not measure to save his life, but he made the best scones in the world because he did everything with stubborn enthusiasm. Mom designed the whole place, warm light, soft booths, the logo hand-drawn until it felt like us. Jade moved up from Portland to be my general manager. She took over schedules, suppliers, and the staff with a ferocity that made me proud and exhausted at the same time. Marcus still dropped by sometimes, mostly to tell Dad that his angles on the shelving were wrong. We laughed a lot. We argued over where the espresso machine should sit as if the placement were a matter of national security. Opening Bennett and Daughter wasn't just a business move, it's a small reclamation. People who came in wanted to see the woman who'd taken back her life. Some came with empathy and flowers, some came because a story on the news had nodded in their heads, and some came because they'd been waiting for a little glad thing to brighten their day. We hired a few people who'd lost time to life's hard turns and gave free baking classes to kids from the foundation. It was messy, imperfect, and exactly what I needed. A place built with my hands and with people who knew my name and meant it. The day we opened, the line curled down the block like a ribbon. It felt like the whole city had come by to breathe with us. The room smelled like cinnamon and coffee and warm bread, the kind of smell that sinks into your ribs and keeps you alive. Mom's cinnamon cookies sold out by noon. She laughed when the tray came back empty, wiped her hands on the apron Dad had insisted she wear, and said, "Well, that's a good problem to have." Dad manned the counter for a while, fumbling with the register and smiling like someone who'd just been handed a very good secret. I stood behind the counter and watched people eat, laugh, and take pictures, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was on the edge of someone else's story. I belonged there. The ache of the 30 years didn't vanish. It still showed up sometimes in quiet moments, when the oven hummed late at night and the house was empty, when I went to tuck the music box under my pillow and felt the phantom of a childhood I never had. But the ache had a different shape now. It was smaller, not the wild hollow it had been. It cut sometimes, but it also reminded me why I'd done all of it. That first Sunday, we sold out. People kept coming back and told us stories about how the cookies tasted like home or how they'd cried on the sidewalk when they read about the foundation. Lydia came on opening day. She stood by the counter, hands folded, her eyes steady. She'd told me once that she'd been scared to speak up for years. Now she stood as a quiet kind of proof that people can change course, that small acts of courage add up. I walked over, hugged her, and handed her a cookie. "This one's on me," I said. She smiled, the kind that looked like relief. At night, after we locked the door and swept up the crumbs, I'd go upstairs to my little apartment and wind Arthur's music box. The melody was small and stubborn and familiar, a thread stitched through decades. I kept it on my nightstand like a promise. There are things I will never get back, people I never met, moments that belong to a life I might have had. But there is also this. A kitchen with my name on the window, a family that calls me by my real name, and a small foundation that might help bring other lost kids home. That felt like justice in the way that matters to me. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it. There are too many quiet cases and too many people still waiting. Everyone deserves a chance to be found. Thank you for listening.